What's up? This is day 2 of my series, Cybersecurity, every day until I get a job. Um, Before I go into what I do today, I just want to update for my job tracker. I did apply to two more, three jobs actually, and I found five more to, look more into. And I applied to two of them, and I applied to one more from a previous day. So that's three jobs applied to today, plus I found three more to look at more. But today was a big day because I really moved past installing and promoting the domain controller, and now I'm actually like managing the Active Directory. So like in the last video, I was focused on just preparing the Windows server to become the domain controller, and that had static IP, DNS, installing, and promoting it. But today there's a new real question. It's, did the domain controller actually promote correctly? So we had to verify it, and can I start actually managing like an administrator actually managing Active Directory? That's my job. So today I verified the domain controller. I checked, a bunch of critical services, tested DNS, and domain discovery. I opened the main Active Directory tools and created my first organizational unit structure. I created some test users, created security groups, and then I actually started learning how companies assign permissions to resources using groups. So, this was probably the first day where the lab just really started feeling like a enterprise environment of just the Windows server. So, gonna just go over here to my channel. So, for anyone new, the point of this series is that I'm studying cybersecurity every day until I get hired. After that, probably we'll start something new, maybe something like cybersecurity every day. But I'm obviously gonna have a job, so it'll be to a lesser degree. And I'm not making these videos as someone who already knows everything. I'm making them as someone trying to become a job ready person by building real skills every day. So the long-term goal is to get into IT or cybersecurity, build projects, learn enterprise systems. I'm preparing for the CompTIA Security Plus certification. I want to improve my resume and LinkedIn, and I want to eventually land a real role. So that's my goal for that. And right now I'm in the Windows Server and Active Directory part of my roadmap because I feel like Active Directory is still a huge part of real world IT and cybersecurity. A lot of job descriptions, they'll mention things like Active Directory, Windows Server, Windows operating systems, DNS, DHCP, group policy, user accounts, password resets, permissions, file shares, troubleshooting. So instead of just being like, okay, let me memorize these words, let me understand theory, I'm practicing with them in real life scenarios. So, to recap from my previous video of day 1, I installed the Windows server and renamed the machine to SRVDCO1. Um, the name is intentional. I then worked on static IP and DNS setup because the domain controller needs to be found reliably by other machines. We talked a lot of this yesterday, and then after that, I installed the ADDS role and I promoted it into a new forest and domain. The domain I'm using is kevinlab.local, and today started the promotion. So we have a mission today. Um, I wanted to verify that the domain controller was healthy. That means, checking the domain, the forest, the domain controller role, the key services, DNS, domain discovery, and basic diagnostics. I wanted to actually begin Active Directory administration. So, that was a big step. That involves, creating organizational units, creating users, creating groups, learning the group model, and actually starting file share permission concepts. So today's flow, you can kind of see it on the notes I have. I have an outline, 6 pages today compared to 2 pages yesterday. Verify the domain controller, check critical DC services, check DNS and domain discovery, run domain controller diagnostics, open the tools, create organizational units, create users, create global security groups. I took a snapshot so that we can get back to this if I mess it up. Verify the AD structure with PowerShell, learn AGDLP, create domain local permission groups, create department file share folders, and then apply basic NTFS permissions. That's a lot. but it all connects to one main idea. How does an organization manage identities and access to resources? So, moving down to here, this is the first thing I did. Um, I wanted to, check that the server was actually promoted correctly. So I opened PowerShell and I run host name. I always run that. It confirms, if I'm on the right machine. Then I ran the command who I am. That shows the current user. And before promotion, I was just logging into, the Windows server. And after, I'm, logging into something tied with the domain. So I logged in and I see, okay, I'm the domain administrator, right? And it tells me I'm inside the Active Directory domain. So then I started learning some new commands. Um, they like you see these at first glance, you're like, what are these? But they're pretty simple. Get AD domain just shows information about the Active Directory domain. Then I did the forest, shows it about the entire Active Directory forest, and then get AD domain controller, which shows information about domain controllers. They're important, right? Because they prove the machine is no longer just a regular Windows server. It understands it belongs to an Active Directory domain. It's part of a forest and it's acting as a domain controller. So the way I'm understanding it is a normal server is just an operating system, and then a promoted domain controller is now part of the identity infrastructure. It stores and manages directory information, it authenticates domain users, supports Kerberos, it integrates with DNS, and it becomes the center of the domain. So after that, there were some things I needed to do. Right here, you can see that we needed to check critical domain control services. So we ran a command right here that checks for NTDS, which is Active Directory Domain Services, DNS server, the key distribution center, which has to do a lot with Kerberos, the authentication, the tickets, man, very important. And then net logon, which is domain logon support. And as you can see in the screenshot, it shows they're running. So I should be fine, right? It shows the service is running. I used the get service command. So it shows the service is running. If they weren't running, the domain isn't going to work correctly, but they are running. So everything's good. Then we worked on DNS and domain discovery. First, we have the ipconfig all command. So, this shows the DHCP is not enabled, IPv4 address, DNS servers, and the DNS suffix. So, a lot of people think DNS is only about websites. Google.com becomes boom, IP address. That's what I talked about in the last video, right? Well, DNS is much more important than that, especially for Active Directory, because domain joined computers, they use DNS to locate domain controllers and domain services. So, if DNS is broken, Active Directory can break. So you see I ran ipconfig all to test it out, and I checked whether DHCP was enabled, what the server's IPv4 configuration looked like, and then what DNS server is it using, and what the primary DNS suffix was. And DNS needs to point to itself, and it's doing the loopback, so we're good. And then after that, I ran the command nslookup kevinlab.local. This is basically used to query DNS. So the command is basically asking, what does this domain resolve to? Then I also tested the same command on srv dco1, which is the domain controller. And that's basically going to check whether the domain name of the server resolves properly. And then I used nltest and then the rest of that command, which I'm not trying to read out. And it's basically used to locate a domain controller for the domain. That's important because, eventually when I join my Windows client, that will be in a future part of this lab, the client needs to be able to find the domain controller. So the big concept here is DNS is not optional in AD. DNS is how the machines will find the domain services, and a client won't magically know where is the domain controller. It's going to use DNS, it's going to use domain discovery, and that's the whole point of this step. Even though this verification seems like very, what's the word, tedious, right? It's important because you're going to see later I found an issue by doing this. So next, we're going to run some domain controller health checks. You can see the commands I ran here. I used the domain controller diagnostic command. And basically, this is a command line tool going to analyze the health of a domain controller. So the first one I ran was the domain controller diagnostic with the advertising. This checks whether the domain controller is advertising itself correctly. To explain that more simply, it's basically telling the domain, well, it's asking, is this server telling the domain that it is available as a domain controller? Because if DC is not advertising properly, then clients may not be able to find it or use it for authentication. Then the second test I did was the DNS test. And this basically, like, you can use common sense for this. We just test the advertising. Now we're testing the DNS. It's going to check if DNS is working correctly for Active Directory. And we know DNS is so critical. I've said this a million times by now, and it passed. So both tests passed, good sign. And now we can move on to Open Directory and the tools. So this is where I'm just going to open this up a little bit. I have to actually log in, which is annoying, but it'll be fine. Can't see my password. You can see the length, but I don't care. Like, hack into this. I don't care. So you go to the tools, you go to the Active Directory users and computers, and this is where we're going to be losing a lot. I like to call it ADUC, ADUC. And this is where you manage users, groups, computers, and organizational units. There's also some other tools I identified that you might need in here. DNS, sites and services, I think domains and trust, and group policy management. Those are some ones that, you know, we'll need to use, but right now we're focusing on ADUC, Active Directory users and computers. So you open, right? You start, so I have all this stuff here, but when you open this, there were default built-in ones. So all these ones with Kevin Lab, I added. The rest built-in. Built-in computers, domain controllers, foreign security principles, managed service accounts, and users, they are all default. The domain controllers, however, off the rip did contain SRV DC01, which is our domain controller. And then the user contained the default account. It now has much more because of what I've done. But this is where I learned a very important distinction. A container and an organizational unit are not exactly the same. I was like, what? There's like so many little different things you need to learn. It's like, bruh, why? So default folders like users and computers are containers. Organizational units are useful for administration because you link group policies to them. That's how they're different. So when I want to apply policies to different departments and computer types, I'm going to want these objects inside OUs, not the containers. So I started by creating my OU structure. Here are my organizational units. So basically, I have users, computers, groups, servers, and disabled. And then inside the users, we have more organizational. Sorry. I have more organizational units, so they're nested inside. So inside the users, we have finance, HR, IT, and sales, just some basic stuff. And then inside computers, we have laptops and workstations, pretty cool. And then inside groups, we have security groups. So those are all the nested OUs, and this is kind of my structure for now. And I want a clean structure that will be able to scale, right? Like, this is just a lab, but I want this to be like a real organization, right? I want this to feel like a job. I mean, I don't know how close this is to a job because I have no experience directly, but I'm trying my best to, you know, work with the resources I have and the notes that I'm finding online. So instead of making random users, throwing them left, throwing them right, you know, trying to structure the domain. And this is going to be helpful when we try and apply group policy later. So now inside the users, obviously inside finance, we're going to have our users. We got Frank Finance. Inside HR, we got Alice HR. Inside IT, we got me. We got Kevin Admin. And then inside sales, we got Sam Sales, right? So we have everybody. These are fake lab users, not real passwords, not real personal accounts. And I also unchecked user must change password at next logon. Like, I'm not trying to change the password every time I want to log on and test these. So, just got rid of all the password restrictions, no restrictions on that. That setting in a real workflow, right, is going to depend on policy. So I want to reduce the friction. It's going to make it much easier. And a user account is not just a name, it has attributes, group membership, settings, security identifiers, permissions. So yeah, we banged that out pretty quick. And then I also created security groups, which is gonna feel weird because I have all this now and I'm kind of explaining it when it already exists. But just focus on the ones that say GG. We have GG finance users, GG standing for global group. So global group finance users, global group HR users, global group IT admins, and global group sales users. These groups represent who the users are and maybe what role they belong to. So, for example, Kevin admin, he goes to IT admin. Alice HR goes to HR users. Frank finance goes in finance, and Sam sales goes in sales. The group type is security. The group scope is global. You don't want to assign permissions directly to individual users. This is why groups are important. So we're going to put them into groups and then we're going to assign these permissions to groups. So if someone joins HR, you add them to the HR group. If someone leaves HR, you remove them from the HR group. You don't want to manually edit permissions across a bunch of folders and systems every time a person changes roles, right? So this is role-based access control, RBAC. Pretty nice. So that's kind of where I ended off. And then I started a second session right here. So kind of have like a break in the notes right here because I, went to the gym and showered, did some job applications. So I took a break because I don't want to, over fry my brain. I don't want to do too much at once. So that was the first part of the day. And in the second session, I moved further into the question, how do companies give users access to resources? And at this point, my lab we have the domain controllers, we have the organizational units, we have users, we have the global groups. So the next step obviously is permissions. So in a real company, your users, they're gonna need access to resources like file shares, printers, applications, databases, systems, but you don't want to give access directly to every individual user. So the model I'm learning is users go into groups are assigned permissions control access to resources. So the chain looks like user, group, permission, resource. Gonna just take a little sidestep here. We created a snapshot where you can, return to a state in the VM. And I just think it was good here. Like, I have the domain controller, I have DNS working, I have the users, the groups, the OUs. If I make some bad changes with permissions, I just want to roll back. So, it was just, I found it very helpful to just create a snapshot there. So now this is where I said, we have this tedious verify structure. It worked out here. It really did. Because next I verified the Active Directory structure using PowerShell, right? And I don't want to just rely on the GUI. I'm trying to get, PowerShell commands, GUI, experience with both. Because you never know. Like, sometimes it's easier to use the GUI, sometimes it's easier to use the PowerShell. I could be doing either or in a job. So I feel like I should be able to use both the GUI, the GUI. I like saying GUI. Some people say GUI. I like GUI or the command line tool. So first I ran get AD domain. We did that. But now some newer commands. So we have get AD organizational unit. We're filtering all and we're selecting them only by name and distinguished names. So obviously it's just going to list all the organizational units and only show based on what we have selected. All my organizational units were visible. Just if you don't know, a distinguished named is the full path of the object inside Active Directory. Then I ran get AD user, and then we filter it and we do name, same account name, and enabled. This is gonna list users, shows useful information like their name, username, and whether the account is enabled. Then I ran get AD group, filtering again by name, group, scope, We're not filtering them by that. That's just the information we're displaying based on the ones that we show. And we're seeing name, group scope, and group category. This shows the groups, their scope, and whether they are security or distributions groups. Then this is where it came in. I'm checking the group membership, right? I'm checking the members within the IT admins, the HR users, the finance users. And I saw an issue. The group memberships did not look like they saved correctly because I did power off the VM because I said I took a break in between the sessions. So that was useful because it gave me a real troubleshooting moment. So I'm just clicking around again. I just fixed the group membership with PowerShell. So I use this command add AD group member, the identity, which is the group name, and the members, just the users I want to add. And it's a good example of why PowerShell matters because the GUI, it's useful, right, for learning and visibility. But PowerShell is really good for verifying, automation, just quick fixes like that. So small issue, but real lab moment, right? What if I messed it up for the first time in a job? Would have sucked. Now I know. So now I'm learning the professional group model AGDLP. Um, Here's a little diagram. It goes user account to global group to domain local group and permissions. It stands for accounts, global groups, domain local groups, and permissions. So the simple flow is user accounts go into global groups. Global groups will go into domain local groups, and domain local groups will be the ones that receive permissions, right? So a beginner mistake would be, hey, Alice, you get permissions directly. And then, oh, Frank, you want permissions too? Sam, you want permissions too? Not right. That works in a very tiny lab, but let's say you scale and now you have 1,000 employees. Do you want to give all of them, permissions directly? No. So assigning permissions to the resource access groups is better. So instead of thinking Alex gets access to HR, we should think Alice is an HR user. HR users belong to a global group, and that global group is nested into a domain local group, and then that domain local group will get access to the HR folder. That way, permissions are easier to manage. If Alice leaves HR, I just change what group she's in, and I don't have to hunt through every folder looking for her direct permissions. So seems small, seems like common sense, but I think it's very important because it can save you a lot of time. It's how people work. And bad access management, it can lead to privilege creep. It can have over permissioned users or security risks. So this is just a good standard to work by. And that's the reason why I took the time to understand the theory, not just doing straight work. I do theory work and then I do work. So I do the theory and I apply it. This is like an example of the theory. I like doing the theory to understand why. I don't want to just do things blindly. I want to understand the theory as well. So next part. So we're creating the domain local permission groups. Just going back to you saw them earlier. You see them here. These are our domain local permission groups. Um, so it's the same thing. There's just one for each, and the name is as follows. The group scope is domain local, and the group type is security. And then I nested these inside. So if I click on DL shares, right, we can see that the GG share sales is in it. If I check the IT, the GGIT group is within the DL. So I nested them in. So obviously the global groups describe an identity or role, and then the domain local groups will describe resource access. So the global group says, who's this person? And then the domain local group says, what resource permission does this role get? So then after this, I set up some department folders. I use these commands right here. Just very, very simple. This is just basic PowerShell creating a new item. It's a directory, a folder. This is the path, and I forced it. And then I confirmed it pretty quickly with this get child item command just to make sure they're all there. I'm just doing that to get in the habit of making sure there's no mistakes, because if I make a mistake and mess up in the real world, I don't want to have to deal with that. So I'm just doing that. And so eventually the HR user should have access to the HR folder. Finance user access to finance, so on, so on. Users should not have randomly access, to other department folders unless there's a specific reason. And this is where Active Directory starts connecting to actual resource access, right? Before this, users and groups were just objects, and now they're starting to control access to real folders. So I started applying the basic NTFS permissions. This was the final major piece, right? They control access at the file and folder level. So I did this through just the Windows Explorer. So I just go to this PC, right? I'm going here. I'm going to shares department and I'm right clicking it, going on properties, going on security, advanced. I added them. So I went to where is it? I swear I added it. I don't know why it's not working. This is gonna annoy me because I just added them through. But what I did right is I let me just try it for this one. Yeah, you can see it here, right? You see the DL shares and they have the so let me remember which ones are not. This is a good chance to see which ones are messed up. So look, you can see these have the domain local group with the permissions. So basically what I did is for this one, the IT folder, I added the domain local group and I gave it permissions to modify, read and execute, list folder contents, read and write. It seems that I messed up with no, they all have it. I don't know what I was doing then. They all work. So I just repeated this pattern for the department folders. I didn't remove any important administrative access like system administrators or domain access. Locking yourself out of a folder would just be pretty stupid. So, yeah, this is basically all I did for the NFTS. So, that's pretty much everything I did today. I'm just going to shut down my VM since I won't be needing it anymore. So biggest things I learned today, you want to verify everything. Don't assume things are working. I learned all those PowerShell commands. I learned about the critical services. We keep using DNS. The domain controller diagnostic command, very useful to check domain controller health. The Active Directory users and computers tool, which we pretty much use for everything. We learned about organizational units, global groups, domain local groups. We learned about the model and what else? And then we did the department folders with the permissions. So, you know, we went over the mistakes. From a careers perspective, I really want to say that today connects directly to real job descriptions. I feel like a lot of IT support, desktop support, junior sysadmins, and even SOC roles, they mention a lot of what I've been doing, Active Directory, PowerShell, user accounts, DNS. I feel like a lot of it is mentioned, and today I touched a lot of those areas in a lab. I verified a domain controller, right? I used Active Directory users and computers. I created users in groups. I learned the difference between global groups and domain local groups. I created department folders. I applied NTFS permissions, and I used PowerShell to verify and fix group memberships. That doesn't make me an expert yet, but it gives me something to talk about. I could go to an interview and I could be like, I watched a video about it, but I can say right now confidently, right? I built a Windows Server domain controller lab. I created a domain. I structured organizational units. I created users and groups. I verified, Active Directory with PowerShell. And I began applying group-based permissions. I feel like that's much stronger. There's also a security side to this, right? Um, Permissions are not just an IT admin topic, cybersecurity. If permissions are too broad, users are going to be able to access data they shouldn't have. And if old users stay in groups forever, that creates privilege creep, right? If permissions are assigned directly to individual users everywhere, our environment will be very hard to audit. If admins do not use group nesting, they could accidentally give users more access than intended. So I feel like access management is a lot about security. And I've learned about this term. It's been coined in my head now, least privilege. Least privilege means users should only have the access they need to do their job. And my group model today, it supports that. So what comes next? Well, there's going to be more steps for this lab. We're going to finish our share permissions. We're going to actually create some server message block shares. We're going to build and configure a Windows client virtual machine, and we're going to join that client to the domain, log in as a domain user. We're going to test access to department folders. We're going to confirm that, HR can access HR but not finance. We want to then confirm vice versa, that finance can access finance but not HR. Then we're going to start working with group policy. And after that, can move on to some login scripts, map drives, event viewer, Sysmon, Defender, and maybe even some SIEM concepts. So my lab is slowly becoming a small enterprise environment. We've discussed what we have. No need to really do much of that. So yeah, that was day 2 of cybersecurity every day until I get a job. Um, a lot of major steps, not just learning definitions, and I'm actually building. I have a lot to learn, but this is definitely starting to become real. I'll keep building from here tomorrow, and the next goal is to continue turning this into a functioning enterprise style lab that I can eventually explain in interviews and show as part of my job search. I'm going to keep doing cybersecurity every day until I get hired. That's day 2 done. Thank you for watching.